Ever wondered what actually makes an action fard instead of wajib and vice versa? If something or some action is farz, it means Islam has made it non-negotiable. It's not a suggestion, it's not if you feel like it, and it's definitely not optional. Every Muslim who meets the conditions is expected to do it. Deliberately leaving a fard act without a valid excuse is considered a sin. Meaning on the Day of Judgment you will be asked about not doing it. If you missed it out of laziness you might face punishment. Think of farz as the bare minimum required from a believer. Everything else builds on top of it. For example, gaining knowledge is farz, for every man and woman. You can't miss it, but if you do miss it, it's a sin. So whenever you hear someone say, it is farz, what they're really saying is, Allah made this compulsory. So if farz is already obligatory, why does another category called wajib even exist? A wajib, on the other hand, is also obligatory. You are still expected to do it, and deliberately leaving it without a valid excuse is still as sinful as leaving a farz. The difference isn't in how important it is. The difference is only about the evidence or Islamic text that decides whether an action is farz or wajib. To better understand it, you need to understand that in Islamic jurisprudence, legal evidence is categorized based on how certain we can be about its authenticity and its meaning. The two primary categories used to classify texts are qat'i, which means definitive or conclusive, and zani, which means subjective. To understand these concepts properly, scholars divide evidence along two distinct angles. First, authenticity or transmission. Is the text 100% proven to be from Allah or the Prophet? Second, meaning or indication. Does the wording have only one possible meaning, or can it be interpreted in multiple ways? Since every single verse of the Quran is qat'i in transmission, having been passed down through mass, unbroken chains of transmission, the distinction in the Quran lies entirely in its meaning. While the entire Quran is 100% definitive in its transmission, the only distinction we look for in the Quran is in its meaning. If a verse has only one direct, crystal clear meaning with zero room for any other interpretation, it's called qat'i. But if a verse uses a word that can have multiple valid linguistic interpretations, then it becomes zani. Hadiths vary in both how they reached us in transmission and what their words mean in textual meaning. Scholars evaluate hadith using a 2-by-2 framework across those same two dimensions. They ask, how certain are we that the Prophet actually said or did this? And does the wording have only one precise meaning, or could it mean multiple things? So, basically, we get this criteria for Quranic verses and hadiths. Either they can be qat'i or they can be zani. For the Quran to be qat'i, it needs a verse that has no alternate interpretation. Then it's a qat'i evidence. For a hadith to be qat'i, it needs to be mutawati, meaning mass transmission in every stage of the chains of transmission, and it also needs to have just one meaning with no room for any other interpretation. However, if a Quranic verse has any other possible meaning or alternative interpretation, then it is a zani evidence, not qat'i. Similarly, in hadith, if a narration is very clear in its meaning with no room for any other interpretation, but it was narrated only from 3 to 4 companions, it's still not qat'i because mass transmission is absent. Likewise, if mass transmission is present, like a hadith narrated by hundreds of companions of the Prophet, but its text has room for another interpretation as well, it's still a zani evidence, not qat'i. So, if we get a command from qat'i evidence, it's farz. But if we get a command from evidence that is zani, it is labeled as wajib. And remember, in Islamic law, zani does not mean weak or doubtful. It simply means subjective, meaning there is room for disagreement based on other evidence or text. Qat'i means definitive, meaning there is no room for disagreement, and denying it is denying Islam itself. Now, some scholars don't know this distinction, and that's why they use both these words interchangeably. That's okay too. I want to add one last thing. I have been studying the Quran for the past 12 years, and I personally don't think there is anything in the Quran that is not qat'i. In other words, I believe its meanings and interpretations are clear. The disagreements and disputes, in my opinion, usually arise when people try to explain the Quran through external sources rather than allowing the Quran to explain itself. If we try to understand the Quran in its own context and in the dialect of Arabic that the Prophet himself spoke, namely the Quraysh dialect, then I don't think there is anything the Quran leaves unexplained. That is why I respectfully disagree with scholars who claim that not all of the Quran is qat'i.